is Dr. Terence Palmer. Terry is a fascinating guy, and I first met him, quite interestingly enough, at a meeting in Reading, I think, around about 4 or 5 years ago, when I was speaking at a conference in Reading, and Terry and I just got chatting in one of the breaks. And it was one of these meetings of minds, we just started chatting and we got on extremely well. We had areas of great mutual interest in terms of a lot of the phenomenon I write about. And Terry wonderfully gave me a copy of this wonderful book here, which, yes, of course, it's there, which I've read about 3 times, and I reread again recently, and there's so many nuggets of information in here, particularly in terms of the concept I have called the egregorial. And for those of you who are unaware of this is something that I discussed in my latest book, The Hidden Universe, where what I'm suggesting is that in some way there is a kind of a feedback mechanism between us and our subconscious and external entities, and it seems to be this kind of, we create them and they use us to come through in some way. So it's far more complex than simply saying that they're hallucinations, which of course a lot of the materialist reductionists will say, and it is also simplistic to say that they're just entities out there. They seem to be much closer to us than we believe them to be. And this is what we're going to be concentrating on today, because Terry's level of experience in this area, both in terms of his academic knowledge, the book is a very, very rigorous academic book. When I was going through it, I felt this is a man after my own heart. Everything he says, he refers back to academic papers, because as Marcello Trui said, extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. Terry knows the players, he knows a lot of the people, and we've just been discussing now, and we'll probably come into this in a few seconds, is Terry's experiences in Las Vegas when he went down and was interviewed by Jeffrey Mishlove a few years ago. But what I'd like to do, Terry, first of all, is for you to tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up in this extraordinary field, and then we can move on from there into deeper areas in terms of your interest and your research.
Okay, well, thank you, Anthony. It's a good place to start. I'd like to begin by saying I'm not an academic. I didn't start out as a scientist. As a young lad, ordinary working class family in South London, I had a sense of adventure. So at the earliest possible age, at the age of 15, I joined the army, and I was in the British Army for 7 years up until the age of 21, when I was discharged with arthritis in the knees and medical discharge. So then I had to try and find a way of earning a living in Civvy Street. So I became a bus driver and then a truck driver, and I spent the best part of my early mature years in the distribution industry as a truck driver, international trucking and transport manager, and worked my way up in the profession to become a transport consultant. Did work for Sainsbury's, Tesco's on their distribution systems. And then in 1990, I was in the Sudan on a consultancy project for Save the Children and the United Nations. Their smallpox vaccines were going missing, and they wanted someone to find out what was happening to them. So that was the peak of my career in the distribution industry, a top-level consultant. When I came back, just after Christmas 1990, I came back to a business that didn't exist anymore. It was the end of the Thatcher era. Thatcher's peak of prosperity crashed. Took my 2 houses and my business and my staff with it. So I came back and had to start all over again. So my house was being repossessed. So I bought myself a van, a guitar and a sleeping bag, and I drove down to Crete. And there I lived as a homeless hermit in the mountains of Crete, asking the universe, what do I do now?
It's quite interesting you mentioning Crete here, because
that sounds like my idea of heaven.
yeah, both Sarah and I love Crete, so the idea of you Creting the Left Chiori must have been incredible. Absolutely.
I found myself in paradise, penniless and homeless, but it was magical. It was enchanting. I met some wonderful people, and that's when my spiritual knowledge began.
Mm.
I began to have, because I asked this question, what's going on here? What's it all about?
Had you ever had interest in this beforehand, or was it something stimulated by your hermit existence?
No, on reflection, when I think back to when I was a kid, when I was in the army as a 15-year-old, I had an underlying interest in hypnosis and in demonology and witchcraft. And I can remember being a member of a book club, buying a book about hypnosis, and I had the encyclopedia, that was it, the encyclopedia of witchcraft and demonology. And it sort of sat on my bookshelf over the years without being dipped into. But on reflection, when I went back and looked at it, I thought, now I know why I got this when I was a kid, because there was this underlying thread that needed to come through eventually. And of course, it was in Crete in 1991 that mystical experiences began to emerge. And the first one, I'm going to have to tell you the story because it's so significant to the beginning of the journey. On my way down to Greece, as I was driving through Europe, I stopped off to see a dear friend of mine who lived in Germany. And she had a daughter who'd married a local in Crete. So I stopped off to see if there were any presents for Crete. It was approaching Christmas time. And she gave me some presents for her grandchildren in Greece. And she gave me a gift as well, which remained unopened in my pack. And as I was sitting contemplating these fundamental questions, what's going on here? I need to understand what's happening. Why have I lost everything? And what do I do now? And then I had this compulsion, and this is where I first began to understand the meaning of obsession and compulsion. I had this compulsion, an irresistible impulse. And this name kept going round and round in my head for no apparent reason, the name of James. Now, my father's name was James, and my middle name was James. But in that situation, in that context, it didn't mean anything, just James. But I had this irresistible impulse to go to my pack in my tent in the mountains, and I rummaged through it and I retrieved this gift that had been given to me by my friend in Germany. And I opened it, and as I unwrapped the package, I'm just reaching for the same gift. It's right here. It fell open at the book of James. There should be a bookmark in there. Because I'd like to read to you what it says. I can find it. Where's it gone?
Archons. The bookmark Archons.
James. Where's James? Now, when I picked it up out of my pack, it just fell open at the book of James. It's not doing that now. I've got to look for it. I've got to find it. Because I'd like to read to you what it says. Okay. This is what it said. And my friend had actually highlighted the text in yellow, you can see.
Yep.
So it stood straight out. And it says, and I quote, "If any of you lack wisdom, then ask God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given to him." And that was the beginning of my education. Since then, every question I've ever asked has been answered.
Extraordinary.
I'm not a religious person. I don't go to church. I don't pray. I don't do any of those things. But a lot of what is written in this book has meaning beyond the institutionalized religion that has adopted it, right? It's more meaningful than that. And the work that I do, and since my journey has led me to this place here, doing the work that I do, I acknowledge that there is an intelligent, creative force in the universe that some might call God. It's not a person. It's a creative energy form, but it has servants, and the servants are spirits. Servants are spirit. There's good spirit. You can call them angels, and you can call the bad spirits devils and demons. If you want to use religious language, that's what religious people call them. But because I'm not a religious person, and I take what I've been given as evidence of, as you would perhaps call it, Anthony, the other dimensions or the other universe. I know that these other dimensions exist because I'm communicating with entities that reside there all the time, every day. In fact, today I did 3 cases today. I've got another 4 cases sitting on my desk to carry on with when we finished. So that's, in answer to your question about my background, that's where it...
Well, I'm really interested now. So you're in this, down in Crete, in the mountains of Crete, and you get the thing from the book of James. Then what happened? Did you then decide to come back? How did you then get on the road you're on? Because it's quite extraordinary from being a hermit in Crete to being who you are now. So what then happened? What did you do? There's this reference in the Bible, but what then did you do? What then moved you along?
I didn't actually do anything. Other people did lots of things around me that I witnessed. One of the strangest things that happened, and I'm taking a period of a couple of years and trying to condense it into a nutshell. To give an example of the sort of experience I had, I was sitting, minding my own business at a cafe on the seafront, and in another village, actually, removed from where I was staying. But this gives you an idea of how the word was spreading in the local vicinity, amongst the locals, about this strange Englishman that lived in the house. The man with the white van.
The white van man. The white van man in the White Mountains. I mean, you couldn't script it, could you?
Minding my own business, having a cup of coffee, contemplating the Mediterranean, and this villager from another village, again up in the mountains, he came and said, "Do you mind if I come and join you?" His name was Vasily, and he lived in another village. And I said, "Oh, Vasily, yeah, please come and join me." And we sat there in silence for a couple of minutes, drinking our coffee. And he said, and then he started talking to me about his problems. He was actually a beekeeper up in the hills, spoke good English. And he was telling me about all his problems. And I said, "Vasily, why are you telling me this?" He said, because you help everybody. Everyone comes to you with their problems, and you never say no to anybody. And this rumor was spreading around about, and I found what he was saying was true. The village where I lived was a place called Azagiris. It's in southwestern Crete, just above Palahora. And people would come wandering into the village and sit in the taverna. I'd be sitting there practicing learning my guitar, and they'd come up and talk to me and say, they'd ask me things. And I discovered that I had this gift of healing where I could stand behind a person, put my hands behind the back of their neck, and they would go into a trance, and whatever was bothering them was solved. So, and this was without any training or without any knowledge or any understanding. And one day, a German who lived there, a young German man, came up to me and he said, "You need to come and see my friend. His wife needs help." And I said, "Well, what can I do?" And he took me physically by the arm and dragged me and said, "Come. And there was a woman sat on a chair on the street, as they do in Greece, and her husband said to me, "You must help my wife." And I said, "Well, what's the problem?" He said, "I've not been able to make love to her for 8 years." And she was a beautiful woman and he loved her dearly. And I said, "Well, why? What's the problem?" He said, "Her back hurts. She won't let me touch her because her back hurts." I said, "Well, how long has this been going on?" He said, "Since she gave birth to our last child. Our daughter is now 8 years old. And since then, I've not been able to make love to her." So now I'm not a doctor, and I wasn't then I was just an out-of-work truck driver, okay, and I knew nothing. But my German friend said, go on, do what you do." So I stood behind her, put my hands behind the back of her head, and she slumped into a trance. After about half a minute, her head came up, her eyes opened, she looked at me and she smiled. And I couldn't speak Greek and she couldn't speak English, so I motioned for her to stand up. And she bent down and she touched her toes. And then she smiled at her husband.
In that way, yeah.
And he said to me, "What kind of magic is this?" And I said, "I have no idea. I don't know anything."
So you were just acting instinctively here. It was just something you instinctively felt you were going to do. It wasn't something you were thinking about. I mean, were you surprised when she went into the trance state? Were you expecting that, or did that surprise you as well?
No, it just seemed a natural thing to do. And I'm cutting a long story short here. There were several incidents. In fact, when I'd come back to the UK to settle some affairs and then drove back down to Greece, and I was on the ferry from INCON, southern Italy, and I was sitting in the passenger lounge again practicing my guitar, and one of the engineers from the engine room, a seaman, came up furtively because he wasn't supposed to be there, and asked if he could sit at my table. So I said yes, and he said, "I like to play guitar. Can I have a go of yours?" So I said, "Sure." Handed it to him, and he went to finger a chord, and it was painful. I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "I hurt my hand in the engine room. I'm not supposed to be here, but I needed to give it a rest." So again, instinctively, I said to him, "Close your eyes." So he couldn't see what I was doing. "Put your hand on the table." He put his hand on the table, he closed his eyes. I hovered my hand over his, and after a couple of seconds, he opened his eyes and he went, "How'd you do that?" So the mystery was there. There was stuff I needed to learn and understand. So that was the beginning of my quest for answers, really. And that really started me off on the journey of discovery about the spirit world, beginning with minor, well, and sometimes not so minor, physical problems. I used to treat insect bites and headaches and ingrowing fingernails and all kinds of stuff. People used to go out of their way to come up the mountain to see me and see me sitting there and join me around my campfire. I was this hermit that lived in the mountains that healed people without knowledge or understanding or training. So I needed to understand it.
Because it's quite interesting, this, isn't it? That there is a very much a Greek tradition of shamanism, although the person that told me a lot about Greek shamanism, Dr. Andreas Mavramatis, doesn't like using the term shaman particularly. But there is this tradition of both the kind of the anchorite tradition within Greek Orthodox religion, whereby people will go and live in isolation. And when they're in the isolated circumstances like you were, they seem to attune into a different kind of consciousness, as if almost the earth forces seem to take control in some way or other, and I'm thinking about the ancient Greek philosophers and everybody else that argue that there's some kind of linkage with the land and everything else as well. So probably within Greece, the magical feeling of that country seemed to very much bring this out of you in many, many ways. So then you come back. So you found you have this ability, which is a complete mystery. It's something you've never been aware of you had before. And then you come back to the UK. And then what happened? Because it's an enthralling and fascinating story, this.
I decided that I needed to be educated. So I'd been educated as a schoolboy up to the then GCE O-level. I went into the army and I was educated by the army. I was taught how to kill people.
To put a not too fine a point on it, yeah.
And then I came out of the army and I learned to drive a truck and I learned to operate distribution as a transport manager. So I'd had these different types of education, but had never been to university, and I decided that I needed to understand these phenomena, and where would I start? And I followed 3 avenues of education in order to try and understand these things. One avenue was to study psychology, get a degree in psychology, so I enrolled to go to university. I needed to understand this business of people going into trance spontaneously, so I studied hypnosis. I went to the Proudfoot School of Hypnosis in Scarborough. And I needed to understand how people communicate with the spirit world, so I started going to the Spiritualist Church and studied with them. So these 3 avenues of learning gave me a rounded perspective, 3 different theoretical frameworks or practical frameworks. And what I discovered from psychology was that, interestingly, I went to Christ Church in Canterbury, which is part of Christ Church, Canterbury Cathedral. But the moment I started asking questions about spirituality, I got my wrist slapped and said, "You're not to talk about these things here. We're here to study scientific, not religion." So I couldn't even mention the word spirit in my studies in university. But what I did learn from them was scientific method, how you measure and how you quantify and how you understand from scientific perspective human behavior. And that was very, very valuable. And of course, I'm using it today in my research. The hypnosis training gave me an understanding. This is only really scratching the surface because I've gone a lot deeper than this since. It gave me an understanding of the power of suggestion as a beginning, right? But what it didn't explain was how to get a person into trance without saying anything and standing behind them. So when I'd done my basic training in hypnosis in Scarborough with Will Proudfoot, and then in my 3rd year of psychology in Canterbury, I decided to join another hypnosis course in London with the London College of Clinical Hypnosis. And it was a 2-year study course over a series of weekends, over 2 years. But because I'd already got a qualification in hypnosis, I was invited to join them at the beginning of the second year. So I had the foundation. And on the very, very first meeting, it was at Birkbeck College, University of London, and there were about 30 or 40 people in the group, in the class, who'd done their first year. So I was coming in as a new boy. And we were given an exercise to do, and I facilitated this exercise with a group of people. And one of them exclaimed, remarked quite loudly so that everyone else could hear. She went, "My God, how do you do that?" And it drew everyone's attention to our little group. So I was taken to one side by the instructor, and I was told not to draw attention to myself by doing things that were not part of the curriculum. And one of the other trainees came up to me during the coffee break, and he said to me, "You made a fundamental mistake here." I said, "What was that?" He said, "You demonstrated something that cannot be explained by modern mainstream methods. And they don't like that because it threatens their authority." So I was expelled from the course on the first day.
So what did you do? Do you know what it was?
Someone without saying anything for standing behind them.
Right, okay. In terms of
how does that work?
Yeah. I'm intrigued.
I'll tell you how it works. It's very, very simple. Right? It works with the power of intention, and it works with spirit communication that's non-vocal. And what I'd later learned and discovered, and you'll have access to this because you've got my book on the subject of telepathic hypnosis. Now, in the 19th century, surgeons, John Esdale and, what was the name of the other one? Esdale and, his name escaped me for the moment, but two eminent surgeons, one in London and one in Calcutta with the Indian Army, used what they called then was mesmerism, before the term hypnosis was coined. And what they would do was use what they called magnetic passes, hand passes, over the patient. And it would lull them into an altered state of consciousness where they felt no pain. And they could perform surgical operations without pain. Now, James Esdale...
Just a question. Could they do this every time? Yeah. Every time they did it? Every person they did?
Yeah, and it was demonstrated at the
Okay.
Hospital. John Elliotson. John Elliotson was a president, or was it chairman of the Royal Society of Medicine, and I'm a member of the Royal Society of Medicine. I've seen his name up, right? And he demonstrated this at the Middlesex Hospital in the 19th century. James Esdale, on the other hand, was in India, and when he was performing operations on his patients, he would prepare them for the operation in advance by inducing them into a hypnotic trance whilst they were having lunch with their family in another room. Now, how do you explain this? If you dip into my book, you'll see references to the work of Leonid Vasiliev, the Russian neurologist, who was inspired by the work of Frederick Myers and Pierre Janet, who first talked about this in the 19th century. And he wanted to understand how it worked. So he performed experiments where he would offer a suggestion, a hypnotic suggestion, delivered in Leningrad, to a person in Vladivostok, on the other end of the continent, with observers to witness and observe and note the response to the suggestion. And over several experiments, it was irrefutable that the suggestion was acknowledged and responded to over such a great distance. And what was interesting about these experiments, that they initiated a whole range of experiments through the British Society for Psychical Research, the Greek Society, and the American Society over several decades, from the 20s into the 50s. And they had international conferences where they would discuss their experiments. People were being induced into trance from Athens to New York, from London to Australia. And it was irrefutable that the suggestions worked and they were acted upon. So what these scientists, serious neurologists, what they tried to do was explain how it happened. And the hypothesis that was being tested was that the suggestion was carried electromagnetically from A to B, and received through the brain as a receiver.
So this is non-local communication. This is, what sort of has been argued for many, many years, that there's non-local communication in the brain.
The concept of non-locality. This was physics. So they were assured that some moment in time with their experiments, they would be able to capture a thought in transit. That was the idea. It's laughable now when you think about it. But what they couldn't prove it. They couldn't support that hypothesis. They couldn't
prove it scientifically, or what?
Explain the mechanics of it.
Right. Yes, of course.
How it travelled from A to B. But what they did prove was that the thought does not travel at all.
It's instantaneous?
It's non-local. It is beyond time and space. It's instantaneous. It doesn't travel from A to B. So if I'm communicating with someone in the United States spiritually, it's instantaneous. It doesn't travel. And this explains for me how I was able to induce a trance to a patient without saying anything. It was my intention for them to go into trance, was acted on immediately. And the value of this is that it bypasses conscious resistance. How wonderful is that?
Yeah, because that's intriguing, isn't it? The idea that in some way communication can take place between consciousness and consciousness at any distance at all, and of course this is very much proven by the 1981 Paris experiment with Alan Aspect and Dalibard and the other associates there, and has been working now for quite a few years with a guy called Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna. So this is a now known physical thing, but in those days it isn't, and even now how brains communicate is a great mystery. But I'm really intrigued by the mechanism whereby hypnotism is effective. I hear stories, for instance, that there are certain people that are more hypnotically susceptible. Do you find that, or do you find that effectively you can hypnotize anybody?
That's a very, very good question, because it's a very difficult question to answer. It's a very, very complex answer. We have to take the model, if you like, of individual differences. The continuum of I'm speaking now as a psychologist and researcher. We all exist on a continuum. At one end of the continuum, people find it easy. At the other end of the continuum, people find it impossible. And you've got the bell-shaped curve, the normal distribution curve. In the middle, you've got Mr. and Mrs. Average, right, who are susceptible to a certain degree, right, but the average. When we're talking about spirit communication and going into trance, at one end of the scale, actually this is in my book, I think it's chapter 10.
Okay.
There's a very, very simple diagram to illustrate this. At one end of the diagram, you've got a sharp, it's a wedge shape. At one end of the diagram, you've got a sharp point. At the other end, it's thicker. and it's what I call the vulnerability continuum. So at the sharp end, you've got people who are not able to go into a trance or have mystical experiences. They're in the here and now, firmly rooted in the physical, right? And that's all there is. Your scientists, your mathematicians, your logical thinkers. In fact, I am on that end of the scale. I find it very difficult to go into trance. On the other end of the scale, you've got people at the fat end who are living in a virtual other dimension all the time. Above the line, you've got your positive, and below the line, you've got your negative. Above the line, the positive are people who are natural mediums. So they're in constant contact with the spiritual world. They hear voices, they communicate with spirit, and they're in control of it because they have a strong sense of self. On the negative side, you've got your psychotic who hears voices. And he would be diagnosed by psychiatry as psychotic because he's having hallucinations. Because psychiatry dismisses the hypothesis that there's a possibility that it's an external source. And this is the area that where most of my research is focused, where I'm working with people who are referred to me by a family member. They may be hospitalized, they've been sectioned, they're on antipsychotic medication because they hear voices. So what we are able to do is to access them and determine whether they are actually having hallucinations or whether there's an external source impinging on them. Now, going back to what I was saying about putting a person into trance by standing behind them, right? Just with the power of intention, puts them into a trance. Now, if I can do that deliberately as a healer, as a psychologist, then anyone with an intention, a focused intention, can do that. And that's a scary prospect. So people who are vulnerable, people who have a very, very loose sense of self, people, as I say, looking at the diagram, the vulnerability continuum. One end of the continuum, you've got people who have a strong sense of self and are focused in the here and now. The other end of the continuum, they have a very loose sense of, a fragmented sense of self.
There is a psychometric test for this as well, isn't there? I understand.
Yeah, dissociative disorder. Yeah. But so in the protocol that we use, we simply ask questions, simply ask the spirit guide. The spirit guide accesses the spiritual energy field of the patient. And I did 3 cases today. I say to the spirit guide, is there anything external affecting this person? Yes or no? You get the answer, yes or no. We used to spend a lot of time investigating the nature and of the species, their origin and so on. Fascinating subject, but it satisfies the curiosity if you've got time. But if the objective is to relieve suffering from a patient who wants relief, don't bother with all that. You just say to the spirit guide and his team, get rid of them. And they encapsulate them and take them away. No negotiation.
I suppose that's your challenge, isn't it? That you have this mixture of the intensely practical because there's a problem that you have to deal with. And you have to deal with it. It's the old thing in business. You don't think about draining the swamp when you're up to your neck in alligators. And the issue is the alligators are very dangerous. They're very problematic and you have to deal with them. But all the time you must be thinking, this is really intriguing. What does this really mean? What does this mean ontologically? What does this mean in terms of epistemology and everything else? Because it's an extraordinary area that most people are in complete denial of. And I would argue because they're terrified of it. It's something they really... Now, for instance, I need to make an aside here because something both Laura Stuckey and Mark Kittimat have pointed out in the chat room that the picture behind you was the picture that featured last week when we had Laura on, and it's exactly the same picture. So we're already having these kind of weird synchronicities of imagery and everything else. Yeah, apparently so. Yeah. Apparently it's the picture that Laura had behind her last week when we were interviewing Laura. So clearly there is something we're creating an egregore here, effectively, I think. So going back, because what I want to do, I don't want to run too fast because I want to build this up slowly so we build up a very effective picture here. So we have the circumstances where certain people, and I would argue that from my own research, I have something called the Huxleyan spectrum, which is not dissimilar to yours in terms of what I call the opening the doors of perception argument, that effectively the further along the continuum, the more you're open to this wider sensual reality, that things can come in, and can invade your spiritual space in one way or another. And it's the identity of these beings that I'm interested in. But moving on, so you discover about hypnotism. But of course, what you're doing is you're doing something unique in the sense that you're going these 3 lines, all of which under ordinary circumstances would be continually separate. But you're bringing them together. You're being brave enough to break out of the constraints and say, this is the phenomenon, this is how it's being perceived. What does it really mean? So can you then move on? So we've done about the hypnotism and the psychology. What about the things that when you started to get involved in the Spiritualist Church, what things were you witnessing there that either compromised your belief system, or things you witnessed that you really couldn't explain any other way by saying there's something extraordinary happening here?
Okay. I'm going to relate to you now 2 stories. And these came up in the because of their importance. They were discussed.
By the way, just quickly, Laura's come back to say it's the exact same picture. It doesn't look like it. It's exactly the same. Just thought to let you know. Okay.
I bought it in Wilkinson's. Actually, Wilkinson's, the home where people.
Oh yeah, Wilco. They have the place of quality. Yeah, Wilco quality. Yes. Oh, interesting.
Got another one up here. Very similar. Those are the only 2 pictures of that size for sale in the store. They're probably on sale now.
Yeah, the extraordinary thing is, though, that Laura lives in Atlanta, Georgia, so I don't think she's got a local Wilco's, but there you go. Anyway, coming back, I just wanted to dodge it in there, but just very, very quickly, before we go into that, just, Sarah, have you got any questions or anything else as well, or any observations you want to make before Terry starts to go into the spiritual side of things?
Yeah, there's some stuff I was absolutely gagging to say.
Go on, you can gag away now. It's your chance to gag.
There was something really interesting to me with regards to Crete and the Minoan kind of folk medicine and magic tradition. And I'm super interested in the history of the peak sanctuaries in Crete, which were all in the mountains. And I wondered if you drank from any springs there, because you would have been in a peak sanctuary location almost certainly. And I think there's a strong sense within Crete that they are magical places and places for healing. And the springs are often associated with that magic healing power as well. But also with the Asclepians, the sleep temples there are some in Crete actually that aren't very well known about. I think there's just 2 in Crete, but there's one on the Lasithi Plateau, and there may have been older ones before the Asclepian sleep temple building tradition as well. And I think peak sanctuaries are a kind of like proto sleep temple. So it would have been a center for healing that was probably conducted through hypnosis, sleep hypnosis, and the same kind of mesmerism and animal magnetism type of thing that you're talking about. So I think that's really interesting. Then you were talking about the Greek Orthodox Church, and within the Greek Orthodox Church, there's this kind of lingering thread from the Asclepian tradition of people take little votive body parts to be healed called the tomata. And so they take these like little metallic plaques to the church of the bit of the body that they want healed, and they leave them as an offering, which kind of relates back to the way the healing would work in the Asclepians as well. But I think one of the things you also said about this spontaneous healing that was occurring that you didn't know how or why it was working, it reminded me of a story I read about, I just had to look it up, called The Shipwrecked Men, which was about this Spanish explorer. It's a real life expedition travel log of this Spanish explorer who was part of a crew that tried to explore the mainland of Florida, and they came across so many obstacles and terrible things that happened to them. And they came across some native people there, and the native people instantly saw this man as a healer, and he could spontaneously heal anyone by making the mark of the cross on them. And he had no idea what he was doing, and he was just doing what they told him to do, but it worked on everyone. And it's a really interesting account, because you can't really see any reason why he would lie about that effect. It doesn't really fit into his narrative. He's like a Christian Catholic man. So it was strange that they took this as a kind of almost pagan, like shamanic style healing, spontaneous healing event.
Well, you've opened up a line of, possibly a line of discussion that could take the rest of the day.
I think you've like tapped into an Asclepian archetype somehow, and now you have Asclepian magical healing powers.
Well, I met a woman. I was driving up to the village one day, up the mountain, and it's customary that if you're driving and someone's walking, you stop and offer them a lift. It's common courtesy. It's a tradition. And I stopped and offered this lady a lift, and she very graciously declined. She was a German lady, and she said, "Thank you very much, but I'm determined to finish the walk. And I said, "Well, there's a taverna at the top where you can rest." So I drove into the village, and she continued with her walk, and she arrived and she sat down and had a glass of water. And then she said to me, "I understand there's a monastery nearby. Do you know where it is?" And I said, "Yes, I do. I'll show it to you if you like." So I showed her the monastery, and she said, "I just want to take some time and meditate there." So I left her alone, and I went back up to the village. And she, after she'd finished meditating, she came up to me, and I've got to be careful here now, because this memory always triggers an emotion. But I'm going to put it as simply as possible. What I learned from this was she was a retired opera singer in Germany, right? And after she'd done her meditation at the monastery, she came up to me and she introduced herself. She said, "We were the priest and priestess of this village 2,000 years ago."
Wow.
So why was I drawn? And the energy I felt from this, and she came up to me, and I heard myself say, "Welcome home." And the embrace that we shared between us, I have never experienced anything like it before or since. It was an energy that is beyond my description. Now, on that same day, a few hours after that, I was due to meet some friends in another village to do some guitar practice, because we were all learning guitar. And I met with them, and I picked up my guitar and started to play, and everyone else went, "Bloody hell, where did that come from?" And this energy from this woman came out in the music. And it was truly magical. It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe it was happening, but I felt this energy pass through me that was impossible to describe. And it's the only experience I've ever had like it. But perhaps that touches on what you mentioned.
Well, I'm very intrigued here as to what drew you to Greece, what drew you to Crete, and specifically Western Crete and the Lefkiori Mountains, because had you been there before, had you visited there, or was it just an instinctive pull that you had to go there?
I was introduced to it by my friend in Germany, the one that gave me the Bible, the one whose daughter married. I met this lady. I was in a conference in Italy with the Road Haulage Association, and this lady had been sent there to this hotel in Sorrento by her eldest son, because she was still grieving the loss of her husband, and it had been going on for some years. And he said to her, "Mother, you are going to go today." And he booked her this holiday in this hotel, and that's where I met her by pure chance. And I've written about this. I'm not going to go into this is a love story that is beyond, again, it's a magical thing. But that's how I met her. So when I was travelling down to Greece, I called in to pick up the presents, but she had taken me to Greece to meet her daughter and her husband's family. And that's how I came to know the place.
Okay, because sometimes, you feel you're driven to certain locations and you find something magical there, as if your whole life has been a series of coincidental encounters and things to get you to a particular place at a particular time in order to experience that.
I was in that exact place in the White Mountains in the middle of lockdown. Actually, I went on holiday there.
And you what do you, I mean, because we both love that area of Crete as well, don't we? So there is something. I did go on a
very embarrassing tourist Dotto train ride with my mum though, which was ridiculous because like in this country, those Dotto trains that are just basically like little pavement cars.
Yeah.
Only go on the seafront in Eastbourne. You never see them on a road. And in Crete, they go all through the mountains on the motorway. It's very embarrassing to be like on one of those. So I lived in Crete for about a year in Ios Nicolas. But yeah, I love it.
Right, so Terry, I know we bounced you off a little bit there, but I think it was important to just go where our collective daemons are taking us on this. So that's what we do on this show now. We don't have a plan. We just go off on tangents, and everybody goes with us. So just going back then to the Spiritualist Church you went to. I mean, you're not religious, but you go along to a Spiritualist Church,
right?
And that must have been extraordinary for you.
I needed explanations for what I was experiencing. Experience something and then go and find out to try and get an explanation for it. So I went to the Spiritualist Church, and there I met a young man in his 20s. His family had emigrated to South Africa, and then they'd come back again, and he was trying to settle back into ordinary life in England, and he had a confidence problem, and he gave me an opportunity to practice my hypnotic skills. So I invited him to my home, and he offered himself as a subject for hypnosis, and we'd had a session. And as he was coming out, and he was a good subject, he wins a good chance. And as he was, can't help laughing about this now. As he was coming out of the trance, he said, I just had a really strange experience. He said, I got the impression that someone wanted to talk to you, but it wasn't me.
Right. Okay.
So I said, okay. Let's see what's going on here. This story was recorded in my interview with Jeffrey Mishlove, actually. So I said, okay, but let's see what's going on here. And he went back into trance. And again, I'm going to condense a long story into a short version. The upshot was that he was being possessed by a spirit entity that was taking over and wanted to talk to me. So I said, okay, let's see what's going on here. And he went back into trance, and then his head came up, he sat bolt upright, his eyes opened, and he looked straight at me, and I said, who are you?
As you would.
As you would. And he introduced himself as a scholar, a 14th century Chinese scholar by the name of Chiang Pi. So I said, well, this is all very interesting. And we had an interesting conversation. And at the end of it, he said he was obviously in the process of paving the way. Because then he said, I would like to introduce you to someone else. So I said, okay. And so he went back into his trance. And then the head came up, and he sat bolt upright, and his eyes opened, and he looked at me. And you've heard this saying, haven't you, that the eyes are the windows to the soul. Right? Well, I've seen this, right? And on that session with this young man with the hypnotic trance, I could see his eyes. But I could also see the eyes of two other people, and they were different. Each time he opened his eyes, it was a different person. So this second introduced entity, shall we call it, his head came up and he opened his eyes and he looked at me. And I said, "Who are you?" Actually, I said it more politely than that. I said, "To whom do I have the honour of addressing?" Because I'd learned from the first one the etiquette. Very, very courteous. And that was, I suppose, the reason for paving the way. It was an introduction. It's like before you meet the Queen, you have to go through the process of learning how to communicate. "To whom do I have the honour of addressing?" And he said, "My name is Lao Tzu."
The Lao Tzu. Confucius.
I had never heard the name before. Lao Tzu and Confucius are two totally different personalities. Completely, they were contemporaries. They knew each other, but they were different people. I had never heard the name in my life. I had no idea who this was. But he started talking to me about the book I was writing. And he was giving me advice on how to structure it and how to structure each book. I said, "How do you know what I'm writing?" And it turned out that it was him that was giving it to me by inspiration, by inspired thoughts. He said, "You've been asking questions, so I'm giving you the answers." When I was in Crete, as I said, I sat there and asking these questions, fundamental questions, and the first answer I was given was this, right? If you've got a question, ask. And this guy was giving me the answers. And he gave me my first book. It's called The Tao of Natural Cycles. It's not in hard copy, it's on Kindle. It's £5 on Kindle. The Tao of Natural Cycles. So this is a channeled work about, now you're not going to believe this, I still have trouble believing it myself. It's how the universe works. It's the way and its power. Is literal translation of the Tao Te Ching. And I'm being educated by its master, by its founder. And this is far too profound for me to even begin to comprehend at that time. I had no idea at all. But he was my first teacher about the spiritual world. And for those of your listeners or viewers who may be witnessing this, who are mediumistic and who have the gift, may be able to see him standing behind me, because he's with me often, inspiring my direction, inspiring my thoughts, which teaches me, and this was the beginning of my education, as I said, if you ask questions, and they're genuine questions, and from the depths of your soul, if you really need the truth, it will be given to you, and it will be delivered by a messenger that you can trust.
Did Lao Tzu say to you that he'd been waiting for you? Why did he choose you? What was it about you that made Lao Tzu come through?
Questions weren't asked. I was just totally blown away. I was amazed. I wasn't able to formulate such questions. I was just too gobsmacked. It took me a long time to accommodate that.
Of course.
And what happened was that I continued with the writing. And then as I was attending university to study psychology, learning academic language, I was enhancing the text with what I was learning so it was more academically readable. And in fact, it took me 20 years before I had the confidence and the knowledge, the knowing, to be able to have that published, because it could have just been fantasy. But I needed to get evidence, and this led me down the pathway of going to university to study mysticism. I did a master's degree in the study of mysticism, where I discovered Frederick Myers and William James.
So where did this take you then? So you then had this extraordinary experience, and being the kind of person you are, you decided, I'm not taking this at face value, I need to understand it more because it's an extraordinary experience. And then you went off and then you started working on, because I know that your PhD was on Frederick Myers, wasn't it, in his work?
Came much later.
Okay, so what is your feeling is taking place here? Are these real entities that are really communicating?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Without any shadow of a doubt, they are personalities exist in a dimension removed from our physical time and space. They're present all the time. Energetic frequency. You have to think in terms of energetic frequency.
And are they in a place that's timeless? In terms of, do they know the future as well as they know the past, or is it they know the narrative of their own lives?
These are questions I try to avoid asking because they're very, very difficult questions to answer. The questions that I ask now are on behalf of my clients who come to me asking for help. I need to know what's troubling them, what's caused it, and how to deal with it.
Yes, as we said before.
So all these metaphysical and philosophical questions, I'm not bothered with all that now. You know, I'm dealing with the here and now.
But you did used to ask it, though. It was something that interested you in the past.
I never knew how to ask questions.
Could you not? I suppose they will only answer what they want to answer, I guess. So you can't structure the questions in quite the same way. Is that the case?
I suppose that what I really need to do for you, Anthony, is to reiterate the fact that I'm not an intellectual. I'm just a simple man, you know, just an ordinary bloke in the street that's embarked upon this.
I think you put yourself down far too much. The level of writing within your book here is phenomenal, and the level of intellectual.
Let me comment on that. Let me comment. I can pick up that book and I think, did I write this?
We say this a lot of my fellow writers, yeah.
But from my understanding, and I've lectured on it. I gave a presentation on this 2 years ago at the Transpersonal Psychology Conference, which is recorded. You can watch it on YouTube. But I talk about this business of inspired writing and automatic writing. And again, it's on a scale. It's on a continuum. At one end of the scale, you've got the inspired thought. Think, that's interesting. Write that down. You know, where did that come from? Most people who write interesting stuff, profound stuff, poetry, music, are regarded by us mere mortals as geniuses, you know. But very often they will confess themselves, well, I didn't do this, I just copied what I saw. Mozart said that. He just copied down what he could see in his vision. He didn't compose it himself. It was given to him. A lot of musicians say that.
Divine inspiration again, what we were talking about last time.
Yeah, very much so. The idea that it seems to channel down from somewhere. One of the things we were talking about was this question of, because I do it as well, rather like you, Terry. You know, I read some of the material I've written and I go, where did that come from? I don't even remember writing it. And you sometimes feel, am I almost living in this kind of Mandela effect world, whereby the book I wrote is changing all the time and I go back to it. It's no longer the book I wrote. So I can very much agree with that. I'm just intrigued. I suppose I tend to question a great deal, and I suppose I'm wondering, you know, what is Lai Tzu doing all the time when he's not communicating? And also I'm also interested in as to whether there is great knowledge that can be transferred to people by people who are in these scenarios, and they tend to talk in riddles a lot of the time, which always intrigues me as to why they don't just say it as it is, you know. But we can't say. Now, coming on from this, I mean, one of the areas I'm really interested in is as a psychologist, this area of overlap between dissociative personality syndrome or condition and people who seem to manifest multiple personalities within themselves that seem to have independence of themselves. It'd be very interesting. You're in a unique position. You can put your psychologist's hat on and analyze it. You can also put on your other hat and say that it's something different. So are you of the opinion, I know the answer, but that these entities are independent of the channel and independent of the medium that they're coming through?
You need to put your question another way, because I got lost in as I was thinking about the answer, you changed the focus of the question.
Okay, let's go back then to break the question down. So the first one is the relationship between dissociative personality condition, or whatever the term they now use, and whether they are independent entities or not. Let's discuss that for a time.
Let's stay with that.
Yeah.
Right now, as we speak, sitting on my other machine sat here, is a manuscript that's been sent to me by Dr. Alan Sanderson. Do you know Dr. Alan Sanderson?
The name rings a bell. I think I know of Ivan Sanderson, but maybe there's a different guy.
Alan Sanderson is a retired psychiatrist.
Okay.
And he's just sent me a manuscript of his book that he's asked me to write the foreword for. Now, I first met Alan Sanderson 20 years ago, and I've put this in the foreword to his book, so it's current in order to answer your question. When I was working as a hypnotherapist for a general practitioner 20 years ago, I began to encounter cases that did not respond to hypnotic suggestion, and they were mysteries to me. And it was suggested to me by a colleague that I contact this psychiatrist in London, retired psychiatrist, Dr. Alan Sanderson, which I did. And he invited me to go up and see him, and I met him. And my first question to him was, Dr. Sanderson, how can you tell the difference between a dissociated subpersonality and a possessing spirit?
Great question.
And I'm just reviewing his book for him now, 20 years later.
Extraordinary.
Isn't that? You can call that coincidence, you can call it synchronicity, call it what you like.
Oh, synchronicities, we have them. We have them all the time, I'll tell you.
So when I met Alan Sanderson, that was my first question. And his answer was, with great difficulty and a lot of training.
So that's intriguing in itself. Funnily enough, many years ago, I wrote a book on near-death experience with a consultant psychiatrist called Mahendra Pereira. And Mahendra, great guy, real expert on particularly near-death experiences in the Sinhalese community. He works down in Australia at the moment, or he has done for many years. And one of the things that he was telling me was he was trained. He's got a number of PhDs and a medical doctorate, but he did his PhD up at Leeds University, and the guy that he worked with was one of the world's leading authorities on schizophrenia, whose name escapes me now, which is quite surprising because normally I can remember these things. It might come back to me in a second. And I had a fascinating telephone conversation with this guy because I was interested in the time about schizophrenia and what we mean when we talk about schizophrenia. And he, like your friend, he was quite quiet for a few seconds, and I just said to him, what is schizophrenia? And he went quiet and he said, I've spent 40 years of my life studying it, and he said, I've still got no idea what it is. And he said, I'm convinced that it is an open door to a universe that we are completely unaware of, and we are at the first steps of understanding. And as long as we are trapped within our materialist reductionist paradigm of considering that anything we can't explain with our science therefore doesn't exist, is the wrong approach. And I think he was very true, and it's clearly your psychiatrist friend, because psychiatrists must come across this all the time. You know, the real extraordinary. I'm thinking of people like Oliver Sacks, for instance, you know, and the work he described in his work. So what's your opinion then?
Well, let me continue with my my first encounter with Alan Sanderson, when he said with a great deal of training and understanding is quite difficult. So then my next question was, well, where can I go and train? Where can I go and study this? And at that time, he had no infrastructure or program of educating people with what he'd learned. And he advised me to go to seek out a couple, a married couple. I'm just trying to think of their names. Linda Deverill, I remember his name. Don and Linda Deverill. They lived down in Kent. Now, they'd been to the United States to be trained by Irene Hickman, who, again, was a pioneering psychiatrist in dealing with spirit possession. And they went to her to be trained by her, and they came back with license to teach her method in the UK. And they set up the Hickman Academy in the UK. So I went and trained with them, and I learned the Hickman method of spirit release. So that was the beginning of my training. Since then, and it's just an introduction into the principles and how it worked and so on. Since then, a lot of water's passed under the bridge, and I've gained an awful lot of experience. So in order to answer that question, how do you tell the difference between a dissociated subpersonality and an intruding spirit? Quite simply is to ask. Now, what I've succeeded in doing over these years is to not try and answer the question myself. I did begin that, and what the Hickman method taught was that the medium goes into trance and makes a connection with the subject remotely, right, beyond time and space. Okay, so the subject is in North America. I'm in UK, and you ask the medium to make a connection with the person who's at a distance, and scan their energetic field to see if there's anything there that doesn't belong. That was the method that I was taught. Since then, in order to make things more accurate and simpler, and I'm always looking for a better way of doing things, right? Because the medium, it's dangerous for the medium, for a start. Because if that person is being possessed by a really dangerous, malevolent entity, what you would call an evil demon, whatever, it's dangerous for the medium. Extremely dangerous. So we don't do that anymore. I don't do that anymore. I just ask the medium to communicate to me what the spirit guide sees. So we don't put the medium at risk. We ask the spirit guides that are already in the spirit realm. And we say to the spirit guide, can you connect with the energetic frequency of this person that we want to help? And the spirit guide makes a connection. And then we ask very, very simple questions. We've got it down to a fine art. And today we did 3 cases, and it took us we did all 3 cases in about 20 minutes. We've got it down to a fine art, because, again, going back to this, if you ask a question and you ask it in the right way, you'll get an answer. And this is how it's done. I will say to the spirit guide, is this person sovereign, yes or no? Sovereignty means that they are the legitimate occupying spirit of that body. If they're not sovereign, it means they're being impacted. Is this person sovereign, yes or no? No? Okay. What do they have with them? And again, going back to the academic classification of spirit possession from obsession, harassment, we ignore all that. Much simpler than that. I categorize negative interfering spirit entities on a scale of 1 to 3. keeping it simple. A grade 1 dark force entity is an annoying, troublesome spirit that's not very powerful, but just a nuisance. A grade 3 is extremely dangerous and life-threatening, and a grade 2 is something in between. So I say to and this is useful for the database, I say to the spirit guide, is this person sovereign, yes or no? No. What do they have with them? 2 grade 2s. Okay, thank you very much, 2 grade 2s. Are you able to deal with this yourself, or do you need help? And if it's a grade 3, they usually call upon higher help. And as fast as I'm explaining it to you now, that's how fast it's done. Finished. Wow. Next item on the agenda. Is this person grounded with the planet? Are they connected with physical reality, the here and now? If people are living in a dream world, if they're having fantasies and they're not connected with reality, they're not grounded. So we say to the spirit guide, partial grounding, okay. Can that be corrected? Yeah, we'll pull them down. It's a metaphor of bringing them back to earth. So the good spirit guides and his team will carry out our request. Next item on the agenda is the inner etheric body. Now, in addition to our physical body in 3-dimensional material, time and space, we have an etheric body, a spirit body. And this is well documented in many, many different texts from many sources. But we call it the etheric body. And we need to know if anything has crept inside and is hiding within the etheric body. And this is where you find the energy of curses and negative suggestions that have been implanted. They're not physical implants, they're suggestions, they're ideas that have been put into the person's consciousness to their detriment. And these are found within the inner etheric. So we say to the spirit guide, okay, looking inside the inner etheric, what do you find that doesn't belong? You could go through a whole list of what you could find, but to keep it simple, we just say, what's there that doesn't belong? Oh, there's a curse. Okay, we deal with it. There's an implant that interferes with sense perceptions, which means that this person is not seeing or hearing reality. One of the symptoms of schizophrenia. We'll come back to schizophrenia in a minute. So we're not investigating the symptoms and the causes of schizophrenia. What we're doing is a blanket scan to see if there's anything there that doesn't belong. Anything, whatever you happen to call it. And these entities can be given all sorts of different names. The Muslims call them jinn, and there's the name INCON for DFE. We just call them grade 1 or 2. Grade 1, 2 or 3, get rid of them.
Yeah, because I thought your section on the book on that was fascinating, by the way, the 1, 2 and 3. And I've heard that gradation many times in the past. Just as a quick aside, I remember now, it was Alec Jenner. But please continue. This is absolutely fascinating. Please continue.
So what we do is we go through, and you have to think in terms of energetic frequency, looking at energy frequency, again, on a scale, on a continuum. And a good analogy I find useful for this is the light spectrum. Now, as human beings, we can only see a portion of the light spectrum that enables us to see in light. We are not able to see the ultraviolet end, and we're not able to see the infrared end. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist, we just can't see it, but it's there. So if we look at the human energetic field, the spiritual energy field of the human being, it resides in a spectrum of energy, right? And what we do, we ask the spirit guide to scan the spectrum of energy to see if there's anything else there in addition to the energy of the human being. So we start with the DFE, the dark force entity, the negative, the grade 1, 2 or 3. And we look at the grounding. Then we look at the inner etheric to see if there's anything hiding inside. Then we look at the chakras to see how well they're balanced and harmonized. Very often, a person who's not in touch with reality or is not able to function, all their chakras are closed down. It's as if the engine that drives them is seized up. They can't function. So we ask the spirit guide and his helpers to reopen the chakras, rebalance them, reharmonize them, so that light can pass freely through the body. Next step, we check the lower frequencies for what we call interdimensional parasites. These are bacteria, spirit bugs, in the lower dimensions, in the lower frequencies. Then we ask, are there any contracts or agreements entered into in past lives that are negatively impacting on this life? And we often find that in a past life, a person may have entered into an agreement with dark forces for some reason. They may have wanted to be powerful, they've using religious terminology, they may have done a deal with the devil, for some reward. And people, it happens. So when they come into this life, the contract that they've made is still in force and still influencing them. So we get it annulled, destroyed, rescinded, whatever, gone, done. What we used to find in the early days, before we refined this technique, we used to have conversations with the possessing entities, and we'd say to them, where you're from, what you're doing, what you're up to. And very often they would say, oh, well, he entered into an agreement with us, in many lifetimes ago.
As a question, why do you ever set the situation where the entities don't engage? Because why would they bother? Why would they bother talking to you if they're up to nefarious things? Why bother?
We don't do it anymore because they tell lies.
Right. Again, interesting. Okay.
So in order to save time, like I said, we've fine-tuned it down now. What used to take a couple of hours, we've fine-tuned it down now to take 4 or 5 minutes.
Right.
Just go through the checklist, deal with this, deal with that, tick it off. The spirit guides are doing, and their team are doing all the work as we are.
Why, again, with the spirit guides, why do the spirit guides need the medium here and you here in order to do their work with somebody on this plane? I guess they can't deal with the 1, 2, or 3s directly where they are because they're in a different location or a different place.
Ask me one question at a time.
Sorry. I'm just so intrigued.
We can answer some of these questions later.
Okay.
Moving on down through the protocol, interdimensional parasites, they're low-level, non-intelligent, like bacteria, like picking up an infectious disease. Get rid of those. And then we check the person's etheric body, their personal aura, their energy field, to see if there are any holes, any portals into other dimensions, because this is where stuff gets through and gets attached. And we check for their dwelling place, their residence, or their place of work. And what we find is that people work in care homes and hospitals or clinics. Their place of work is peppered with interdimensional portals. So if you really want to get sick, go to a clinic that's full of portals, because people are vulnerable. We did one exercise where we investigated this, and we found a hospital where there was a gang of dark force entities hovering and waiting at the entrance to the hospital, waiting for the ambulances to arrive so they could abduct the person's spirit before they, as they died, and capture them. And these captured spirits are prevented from going to the light. They are put into, they're enslaved by dark forces, and then they are used by professional sorcerers and people who use cursing to drive into the etheric body of the victim, and with the deliberate intention of driving them mad. And there's another answer for schizophrenia for you, if you like. So where are we? On the protocol. Yeah, the next step, I'm going to answer your question. We're going to get there about dissociative disorders and entities. So where we get to contracts, interdimensional parasites, portals. So we discover the portals and we have them closed, but making sure that everything that's crept through is removed first.
How are the portals closed? What's the technique for doing that?
We just ask the spirit guides to do it.
And they can just do it?
Yeah.
Why don't they do it all the time then?
Well,
why do they leave the portals open if they can just do it?
Let me answer this again. Very, very difficult question to answer.
Okay.
Because I don't have the exact answer for you.
Okay.
I'm going to use a metaphor.
Okay.
As I said earlier in our discussion, as a young man, I was trained by the army. So from the age of 15 to the age of 21, I was conditioned to think like a soldier, and I still do to some extent. And I see the work that I do is as a foot soldier, right? I'm going into enemy territory with my armour. I'm protected. And I have respect for the enemy, and I'm not going to try and fight this enemy. I'm far too clever to do that, right? Only a fool would enter into the dark with the intention of doing battle with the dark. That's an absurd idea. So what I do, I see myself, going back to my army days, I was in reconnaissance. I worked in the Middle East in reconnaissance, and it was my job to go out into the desert and the mountains and recover lost patrols and find them and bring them back. I was only 21 years old at the time, but I was very good at it. And I'm doing similar work now. I'm going into the dark, right? But I have my invisibility around me. I'm not showing my light, but I'm doing it with the help of a medium who's able to communicate. Now, medium is like a telephone operator between the person who's doing the work and the person who's receiving the information. Now, the spirit guides are the ones that actually do the work. So when we go in to a situation and we want to find out what's bothering this patient, I'll ask the spirit guide, as I've said, is there anything there? Yes, we found this. Can you deal with that? Or do you need help? Calling in for help is calling in the big guns. Again, military terminology. I'm just the reconnaissance. I'm the foot soldier.
It's a good analogy. Good analogy.
I'm there to see what's there. Is this dangerous? Let's get rid of it. Get on the blower and call up the big guns. How do they do it? I'm not interested. I don't want to know how they do it because I don't want to do it myself. I just call on the expert. It could be an airstrike. I don't want to learn how to fly a bomber.
So in effect, what there's going on is there is a continual warfare going on between these forces of darkness and the forces of good, in effect, I suppose, in simple terms.
You could put it that way and you'd be quite accurate, actually. So getting back to answering your question about dissociative personalities. So we go through the checklist, the protocol, checking all these frequencies, energetic frequencies on different levels to see what's there. Then we get to the level where people who've died and they haven't ascended to the light, they've remained earthbound. These are your ghosts, if you like, your hauntings, your poltergeists. So the next question on the protocol is, are there any earthbound spirits attached to this person? Yes or no? Yeah, okay, well, now there are three different types of earthbound spirit. There are those that have remained here for unfinished business and because they have a connection with the earth with unresolved issues that need to be finished, or because there's an emotional connection. So the first type, there are three types. The first type is the type that would be known to the host. In other words, a friend or relative who's died that they would know. and they're hanging on for a reason. So we engage those in conversation, and we say to them, why didn't you move on? Why are you connected to this person? Oh, because, and they give their reason. And then we say, right, we're going to invite you to move to the light now. Is there a message you'd like us to convey to the person you're attached to? Because they don't know you're there. And they will give their message. And it's all recorded. Nothing is edited out of the recording. The client gets that recording. So-and-so contacted you with this message. And very often, it's quite funny actually, very often you'll get a message from a work colleague or an acquaintance at work that they were close to. They were on the same frequency with. So there's, it's like attracts like it. It's an energetic frequency that's sympathetic. We call it sympathetic resonance. And very often you get a work colleague saying, is there a message for your friend who's still living? Yeah, tell them to pull their socks up and get a grip of it. And it comes across just as ordinary stuff like that, person to person. The second type that we get are those, again, it's sympathetic resonance. There's an energetic frequency that is sympathetic, where the earthbound is attracted to the host because of the energy frequency that's transmitted by the host. An alcoholic will attract dead alcoholics, for an example. Another example, if you've got a woman who has strong maternal instincts and has deep compassion for children, she will attract dead children, people who've died very, very young. And they just need that comfort of the mothering instinct. So we often have cases of women who've got a gang of kids around them, you know, because they love children. So we just invite someone to come from the light, past family members, and escort them. The third type of earthbound spirit are those, as I mentioned earlier, that are captured by dark forces at the hospital entrance, enslaved, and forced into the etheric energy field of the host with the deliberate intention of sending them mad. And they'll hear voices, and they'll exhibit psychotic behaviour and so on.
And by driving them mad, what do they achieve? What's the motivation for doing that, or is it just because they're evil?
Don't ask them why they're doing it. We just get rid of them. That's the objective, is to relieve the suffering.
Of course, as we said before, you know, effectively you're there to just deal with the problem because you can't engage with the issue. Yeah.
When we first started this, it would take a couple of hours to go through a case.
One of the questions that would be a very interesting one to ever get an answer to, and I suppose there's no easy answer, is why some spirits move on easily. And is it just because they're attached, that they just don't know they've died, or do they know they've died and they're still attached?
We'll come back to that.
Okay.
But for now, I'm still focused on answering your first question.
Okay.
How do you tell the difference between a dissociated subpersonality and an attached entity? You asked the question. So when we finish with the earthbounds, there's one more question before we move on to answer that one. We ask, is there any soul loss, any soul fragmentation? Are there any bits of the person's soul that have been left behind? You know, in past lives, attached to other people in relationships, all manner of reasons why people lose a part of themselves. And it's in our emotional language, isn't it? He was beside himself with grief and all that stuff. It's all in our language. So, I mean, you could write a book just on that one subject, but to keep it simple, to keep it concise and relieve the suffering, we just ask the simple question, is this, do we have a negative self-created thought form? Yes or no? Do we have any dissociated subpersonalities? Yes or no? Yes. Oh, okay. What age? Oh, there's three. One created at the age of 2, another one at the age of 5, another one at the age of 11. So this person's got 3 dissociated subpersonalities. So then we go through, and I'm not going to go through the procedure for you at the moment because I want to keep it keep it tight. There is a procedure for reintegrating them using this method. So the self-created thought forms, the negative self-created thought forms, self-sabotage, if a person's taking drugs or drinking, if they've got perennial anger or perennial anxiety to me just a push word for fear, if they live in fear constantly, and of course many people do. But the self-created thought form of anxiety, of fear, is self-created. There's no reason for it. It's just imagined. Which brings us to again, another classification of possessing entity. You can have the self-created possessing entity or the self-created thought form. And a classic example of that, it's referenced in my book, is the case of Achille in southern France that was attended to by Pierre Janet. And he had travelled from Marseille to Paris on a business trip, and whilst he was there, he spent time with a prostitute. And when he went back to his family, he felt so guilty he needed to be punished. So he created the devil to punish him, and showed all the signs of demonic possession. So his family sent him back to Paris to the psychiatric hospital where he was attended to by Pierre Janet, and they sent him to an exorcist, and the exorcist said, it's not a case for psychiatrist, it was self-created. So, and that's an extreme example of the self-created thought form. Another type of possessing entity is the genuine one, that is a real spirit that is attacked. But in between, you've got this grey area of the imagined one. It's what we call pseudo-possession, pseudo-self-possession. And we had a case today, actually, this very day, of a woman somewhere in Europe who'd been to an exorcist. And the exorcist had done his thing and given all the prayers and everything. And she felt a great deal of relief from it. So he'd done his job. There was something there. He got rid of it. She'd come home, and then after a few days, it manifested again. So she came back onto us, and I said to Chen through our medium, right, we've got a repeated case here. We've got a repeated case. Either we've missed something, we need to have another look, it does happen, or this person's not following instructions and keeping themselves safe and protected, or they're imagining it. Ask a simple question from a trusted spirit guide and you will get a simple answer. Chen, what's going on here? Oh, she's imagining it. She's so afraid of it, she's creating it in her own imagination. So those are the three different types of possessing entity: pseudo-possession, self-created, and genuine. And we need to know how to tell the difference. And that's how we do it.
Of course, because it must be absolutely crucial that you identify what you're dealing with, and again, this is one of the areas that fascinates me. That's why I'm finding this.
That's how you.
Yeah, because I'm saying that's why I'm finding this so fascinating.
That's how you tell the difference, Anthony. You ask a trusted spirit guide.
Absolutely. Superb answer. I really gained so much from that, because it really brings it into perspective from your viewpoint exactly what you're doing, because you are at the front line all the time, that the number of cases you're dealing with on a general basis. Sarah, have you got any questions you'd like to ask at this point? Your mic's on. Your mic needs to go on.
Kirk's asked a question on the chat. He says, does the concept of spirit leaving the body go against the whole demon idea, falling out of time, fractally reliving the whole timeline again? I guess that's a question for you.
Yeah, not particularly, because what we're talking about here are timelines. What we're talking about in the Damon Eidolon dyad is that you enter a different form of time-space but you never actually reach the point of death. So everything that my model talks about is events that take place before you die. What Terry is dealing with here is people who have died. And it's a totally different thing in many ways. And sometimes people get a little bit confused about my overall hypothesis. And I'm not talking about what happens after you die. I'm talking about what happens before you die. And effectively, this whole thing about past lives and everything else as well, I would argue that, that in the final analysis, we are once one personality, one entity experiencing itself subjectively, and there are different levels of going out towards the Jungian idea of the over self and everything else as well. So there's not a contradiction here at all. And one of the things that I'm working with at the moment is really trying to understand the role of non-human entities in these things, as to what they really mean. And it's an area that I'm learning a lot about, but I'm still very much a novice in this, even though I've been interested in the subject for most of my life. The more I listen, the more I talk to people like Terry, the more I learn about it, because I'm not at the forefront of all this. Terry, it is amazing that Terry is dealing with cases every single day in, day out. And what did surprise me, and it was something that Terry and I discussed, was that when I posted on Facebook a couple of days ago Terry's website, Terry had to take the website down because so many people were trying to contact him. So clearly there is something out there that is overwhelming. There is so much of it. And who knows? And it's an interesting point, Terry, with the circumstances now with lockdown. We're in a unique set of circumstances here. Are you finding that more cases are coming through because of this, or how is that panning out?
No, the stream of cases is pretty constant, really, for me. But would you excuse me just for a moment? I just need to go and put a light on because...
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah. One of the things you learn doing this show. I'll just, while Terry's doing that, yeah, because it's one of the areas that... One of the things that people think about my hypothesis is that, it's set in stone. It's not. It never has been. The more I learn, the more I understand. I will adopt and I will change. And if I find information that contradicts the things I'm writing about, that's fine. It's not a problem to me. We are here to try and understand what the human condition is. We're here to understand exactly what happens to consciousness at the point of death. So there's not necessarily a contradiction. I would argue that I would like to believe that my hypothesis is based on pure science. It's based upon observation. It's based upon people's experiences. So I'm taking it from a totally different viewpoint. But effectively, if we're all creating in many ways or collapsing the wave function of our own realities, alternate situations can arise. As Terry rightly says, what Terry observes is incredible. And I genuinely have no issues with these things at all. And I think we're all here to learn. This is the point of it, trying to understand what is going on here. And I sometimes feel that we're on the edge of a huge ocean and we only know our little tiny beach. And there's this huge universe out there. And as Terry's analogy before, I call it electromagnetic chauvinism. And it's the same kind of principle. The idea is we believe that the reality we perceive is just because of the tiny bit of the electromagnetic spectrum we see. And I mean, many of you will know my analogy on this a few years ago when I said, imagine that the electromagnetic spectrum is the Mississippi River that starts in a tiny lake in Minnesota and runs down to the Gulf of Mexico. The visible spectrum that we see everything by is 1.5 inches, about 8 or 9 miles south of Hannibal, Missouri. But we think that that's everything that there is. There are different vibrational states. We know that physical reality we see is 99.211 nines empty space.
Well, we do have some sort of magnetoreception. And I think even if we could see magnetic fields, we would have obviously a completely different view of reality. Terry, I wanted to ask you about how this works kind of cross-culturally, because one of the things I really remember from being a kid in the 80s was stories about especially African churches where children had been killed because they were claimed to be possessed by spirits. And if you've ever come across anything like this in your work.
Yes, our client base spans the globe. We have clients coming to us from everywhere. We've had them from Africa, from South Africa, from the United States, because apart from First Nation, everyone in the States is an immigrant. They come from somewhere else. and we often have cases in the United States where I can't help raising a chuckle when I think about these cases. Not very pleasant for the people concerned, but when I find the explanation amusing. I must confess, and I apologise for that, but I can't help raising a chuckle. People come to us out of desperation, suffering very, very badly. So again, without getting involved in the emotional dimensions and with the sympathy and everything, I just ask a simple pragmatic question of the spirit guides. Go through the check. What's going on here? And we get a straight answer. And I'm going to give you an example here of a family who in North America who had branches in different parts of North America, in Atlanta, in New York and other places. And the family were fragmented. They were fighting with each other, they were struggling with all sorts of things. So I asked the simple question of Spirit God, what's going on here? He said, well, the family originate from Africa, and 300 years ago, they were cursed, and they're still experiencing the outcome of the curse. So every single member of the family, every newborn that sprang from that family was suffering from a curse that was put on them in Africa 300 years ago. So we said to the spirit guide, is there anything you can do about it? Oh yeah, we can deal with that. We'll just get it, destroyed and annulled. And that client actually invited me to Atlanta to meet him and his family. And I spent a wonderful time with him in Atlanta. And he introduced me to a friend of his from another cultural background, a gentleman whose family were second generation immigrants from Asia, not Africa, Asia this time. And they were suffering something very similar. And the whole family were being affected with arguments and financial disasters and so on. So we dealt with that. And I was very, very fortunate to be invited to Florida to a party given by this family to celebrate their new offspring, and the entire family was celebrating the lifting of the curse that had been affecting them for hundreds of years. So you just know, you can speculate on the origin of these things, you can speculate on what's causing the problem. And when you take modern medicine and psychiatry, what medicine does, it will give a label, it will give a diagnosis according to the presenting symptoms, right? But that doesn't tell you anything about what's caused it. Now, I'm not interested in symptoms. In fact, what I'd like to do to you, if we've got time, I'd like to read to you the note that came with a case that we dealt with today in complete confidence, in anonymity, and all confidentiality respected.
Yeah, because I was very keen for you to let us know about this, but I'm aware that the confidentiality is you have to be very, very sensitive. Absolutely. But if you're willing to share, that would be wonderful, Terry. Yeah, absolutely
paramount. So I'll just give some information, an example of how we deal with these things. So I will receive the request from a client, usually for the benefit of someone else. You get a self-referral, or you can get a referral for a family member or a friend that are concerned about it. And I'll get a short description on what the problem is. Now, I never tell them, I never give that information to the medium or the spirit guide. So my first test of efficacy, if you like, is to see if there's a correlation between what's found and what's reported. And I find that most amusing. So I look at the case and I go, okay, that's interesting. And then we'll do the case without giving any information away. And then the third step in the process is to wait for the feedback. Did it make a difference? Yes or no? Are you feeling better? Yes or no? And I grade the responses, again, putting them simply, from 1 to 5. A grade 5 is a written testimonial for publishing. Right? A grade 4 is feeling much better, thank you very much. Grade 3 is better. A grade 1 is haven't noticed any results yet, and 0 is negative. So I keep a record of these, and they can be studied for their tests of efficacy. So when I get a whole family that's been suffering for several generations, invite me to a party in Florida, is that a testimonial or what?
I would think highly likely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So, are there any rival psychic detective agencies, Terry? Have you got like anyone else that does a similar kind of job to you that you like might do the same job on? If because it seems quite niche, but I'm sure there must be other organisations doing the same work.
I suppose I know just about everybody who's in the business doing this. You know, there are several people doing it, and over the past 20 years or so, I've got to know most of them. We exchange ideas. In fact, we have a Facebook group. It's called Spiritualist. It's called SRT Practitioners. You can look it up on Facebook, SRT Practitioners. And to be a member of that group, you either have to be a student or a practitioner of spirit release. And I think we've got 250 members, something like that.
Do you always work with the same medium, or do you have a few different mediums that you work with?
Well, some years ago, we were suffering, just working with Andrew, the one medium, we were becoming so overwhelmed with cases. I said to him, we've got to do something, because he's got a full-time job. He's got a wife and family, and he's got a mortgage to pay, he's got to earn a living. So he can only do it part-time. So I said, what are we going to do about this? And Chen, the spirit guide we work with, said, you've got to teach other people how to do it. So a couple of years ago, we set up a training program, and we've taught people over the past couple of years. Has a degree of success. The objective was to get a group of practitioners that I could call upon when Andrew was busy. We had half a dozen people, but they tend to come and go. They've got their own reasons. They've got their own lives to live. We had some trainees that come to join us thinking, oh, this is a good way to earn a living. Well, it's not, you know. It's extremely dangerous, because if you're not protected, if you're targeting or calling on the big guns to target dark force entities, you're in the fire, you're going to put your head above the parapet, you're going to get targeted. So
have you ever had any dangerous encounters?
Oh yeah.
Could you tell us? Are you allowed to tell us of any particular examples? Because this is probably going to be hair on the back of the neck stuff, but it would be quite interesting for our watchers or our listeners to hear of any.
What we used to find in the early days is that you get what we call psychic attack. You get woken up in the middle of the night, or the first time I had psychic attack, I was working with a client when I was doing face-to-face work before I was doing remote work. And she made an appointment to come and see me. And on the day before she came to see me, in fact, 3 days before she came to see me, I came under psychic attack. I was prevented from sleeping. When I laid down to go to sleep, I'd get a pain in my middle area that made me want to sit up. So I'd sit on the edge of the bed until it disappeared, and then I'd lay back down again, and the pain would reappear. And I'd turn on my side, and it would reappear the other. So every time I moved, it went somewhere else. And I thought, this is really weird, this is. And on the morning that she came to visit me, I was still in bed. And I managed to get to the front door And as I opened the front door, I was bent double, and I had to reach up to the doorknob to open the door. And she said, "My God, what's happened to you?" And that was how this entity was affecting me, preventing me from working with it. That's an example, right? So what we do, we protect ourselves. I'm going to show you something. This is one of the methods of protection that I use. It's a Tibetan gong, Tibetan bowl. They don't like it.
Why not? Why not?
It's the energy. It's the frequency. Energetic frequency. But there are lots of different methods you can use, and people have written. David Ashworth wrote a book, Dancing with the Devil, that we recommend to our readers. But what I found in teaching people is that if they didn't listen and put into practice the protection protocols, they were getting zapped and getting knocked out of the arena, so to speak, and saying, well, this is not for me. So what we have to do now is vet very, very carefully the people we train. So filtering down the number of people that come to training, we've got filters in place for us saying this is dangerous work and you need to be professional in what your discipline is. So it's not for the curious.
Well, actually, Terry, you know, I'm not speaking out of turn here, but one of the things that I was in contact with you a few weeks ago when I was indirectly contacted, then contacted directly by somebody whose partner was manifesting all kinds of disturbing manifestations. And I have to say that for me, that was the first time I've ever sort of come close to something really quite disturbing and really quite, you know, out of my experience, and something where I'm thinking, you know, I write about this stuff, but I'm not an expert in any shape or form. And it's really quite terrifying because you realize just what's going on here, you know, and, you know, me with my scientific hat on, I could analyze this to the nth degree. But for other people, it's very, very real. And it's very, very dangerous, you know, and we're dealing with people's hopes and fears and everything else, aren't we? You know, it must be phenomenally stressful for you. You know, in all honesty, it must be.
No, because we've learned how to protect ourselves. We're sensible, and we know where to draw the line. In fact, second example I'm going to relate to is very, very recent. As you know, my long-term objective is to have a serious documentary made about our work so that it can be widely publicised. And for that, we need to be able to present the evidence. And for that reason, I'm collecting cases for case study to show the efficacy. And we receive requests from people constantly asking for help. So it's very, very rare to receive a message. I got a message from our dear friend Jeffrey Mishlove a couple of months ago saying, I just had a very, very long conversation with a gentleman who shall remain nameless, who's very interested in your work, and he's got lots of money. And I thought, oh, great, perhaps we can now get someone to invest in helping us make documentaries. So I was quite excited about it. So I had this conversation with this gentleman and he said, oh, very interesting. Yeah. And then the following day, I had Andrew get on to me saying, do you know what? He said, last night I came under the most severe psychic attack I've ever experienced. I thought I was going to die. He was woken up in the middle of the night with a heart attack, and he was being told definitely, categorically, to stay away from this case because this is above our pay grade. Very, very dangerous. And I'm not going to make any references to that particular case at all, because it's strictly confidential. But when we get a warning like that, then we know to back off.
And can you kind
There
of
are forces.
can you then register it up? Is there a kind of an SAS, as it were, of what you do? You know, you were saying you're a foot soldier, but are there SAS people that can be contacted if somebody then, if it finds that it's really so much you can't deal with it either?
Well, to be honest, until that incident recently, I thought we were the SAS. I don't think you could go any higher with the entities that we work with. Extremely dangerous, and now spirit guides and their helpers are extremely powerful. But this was beyond that.
Right.
So I don't have an answer for that. But when we are told by the spirit guide, back away, then we do as we're told.
Do you ever get any entities that come back? That, you know, you experience one entity in one set of circumstances, and then suddenly a year later or something, you'll be in another case, and the entity will say, "Hi Terry, it's Asmodeus here. We had a set to a couple of years ago." Have you ever found that?
No, we don't. Of course, we don't enter into dialogue with the entity.
Oh, of course, because you don't. Yes, of course.
When we get a client come back and say, "I've still got a problem," it does happen. We've either missed something.
Yeah, because it's interesting, isn't it? Here again, one of the
they're not following instructions to keep themselves protected.
Because one of the areas I'm quite interested in with another group I'm working with at the moment is we're dealing with taking forward my concept of egregores. And, you know, we've got the concept of the hungry ghosts, the idea of entities that mislead, that come through mediums and tell people complete lies. And you touched upon this earlier on, didn't you? You know, that some of them, you know, the Lord of Lies, you know, that they will say anything in order to get whatever they want. And in this regard, I'm reminded of the work of somebody that's been on this show before called Paul Eno, who works in America, and he, you know, very much he's an ex-Catholic priest, and he's very much of the issue that these entities are almost like psychic vampires. You know, they make you frightened, and by your fear, they can actually feed off the fear. It's as if this is what they're to do. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Fear is a negative energy that's transmitted, and it's an attractant. It says in the Bible, what you fear will come upon you.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, I'm aware that we're just over the 2 hours. And any final questions from the question group, Sarah, and any other final points you want to make, and then we'll move forward.
I was just going to say that I think that's our fastest 2 hours yet. That really flew by. That was so interesting, Terence. I think you should actually make like a sitcom for Netflix, because actually a sitcom about rival psychic detective agencies would be amazing, and you could like sneak in your more out there ideas, and I think that fiction is the best way to get your out there ideas appreciated by an audience. I think that would be brilliant.
Well, there are all sorts of ideas that are being tossed around at the moment. I've got a very, very dear friend who's actually a medically trained doctor, Graham Taylor, mention his name. He's a dear friend. He came to one of my lectures at the SPR in London a few years ago, and he's been a supporter of my work ever since. And it was he that suggested the idea of creating a documentary. And that is still our main objective. But we do get suggestions from time to time, as you just said, Sarah, on ways to go about this. Now, whenever I have a conversation with Graham, he always says our conversations should be recorded in much the same way that we're recording this now. So I said, okay. And we were sitting in the library in London of the SPR. And we were having a conversation while we were waiting to attend a lecture being delivered by Cal Cooper. You know Cal.
I know Cal. Yeah, Cal's been on this show. Yeah, I know Cal.
So it was one of his lectures, and we were just waiting for it to start. We were sitting in the library, having a chat and a cup of coffee, and Graham said, "This is one of those conversations that should be recorded." And I said, "That's easy done." I just lifted the lid of my laptop and said, "Carry on talking." Right? And we had this conversation, and then another member walked in and said, "Am I disturbing you?" And we said, "Well, just having a chat. Come and join us. It's being recorded." So he gave his £2, right? And it was an interesting conversation, so I put it on YouTube. And then I got my wrist slapped by the SPR for doing it without their permission. So it's got to be done carefully. The SPR.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
that's
so.
why I really like the narrative format, though. You know, the story format works so well because you don't have to ask anyone's permission, or things can be presented entirely as you want them to be, and you've got that creative license that I think actually, you know, I think we get a lot of our ideas filter through divine inspiration, through art, and actually the most profound truths come through art often. Ros asked, where's Ros's question gone? Ros asked a question about how long after a person dies do they remain earthbound before they transition? I think it was something like that.
Well, that varies an awful lot. It depends on the nature of the death. If a person is prepared, and a lot's been written, Peter Fenwick and his wife Elizabeth wrote a book about the end-of-life experience, educating caregivers in hospices about how to treat people when they're nearing death. If a person is prepared, they know they're going to die, it is not a distressing experience. It's very peaceful. I speak from experience here. I had a very, very close encounter with death a couple of times. And I experienced resignation and total absence of fear. It's not a fearful thing to happen at all. What's distressing about death is the way that it happens. Now, when a person's expecting it, if at the end of life, if it's a disease and they're drifting away, then they will leave their body, find themselves out of their body. And we've had several encounters during training sessions, actually. You've just touched on the subject here, that is still a subject for formal research. And this is a very easy thing to research. You get a medium to focus their attention on the hospital with the presence of spirit guides for protection and advice and so on. And you say, are there any earthbounds in this hospital? And it's always yes, because people die in hospital who have no belief in the afterlife, and then when they find themselves out of their body, they can't understand it. I'm going to tell you a funny story now about my dad, right? When I was studying for my master's degree in mysticism, he said to me, I don't know why you're interested in all this stuff. It's a load of nonsense. When you're dead, and that's the end of it. So I said, okay, Dad, I'm not going to, he was in his 80s. I said, I'm not going to try to get you to change your ideas now, but I will tell you this, Father. I said, on the day you die, you'll know. And left it there. 2 years later, after he had passed, and I was at a conference at Bangor University where I did my PhD. I was invited to present a paper there, and that gave me the foot in the door. And whilst I was there, I was attending with another delegate to this conference. He invited me to go with him to a local Spiritualist church. So there we were, sat in the congregation with a medium from Liverpool. She was very good, and she picked us two out of the congregation. She said, I see these two gentlemen here with mortarboards. You're at university, aren't you? So she was on the money there, and she said to me, she said, I've got two messages for you. One is from your dad. He says you're right. So he learned. And then she said, the second message is from a spirit guide that says the work you're about to embark upon at the university will succeed. So that book, The Science of Spirit Possession, is their doing. I'm just an instrument of communication.
And an excellent book it is too. I mean, and I do strongly advise anybody who's interested in this subject to really check Terry's book out, because it's an incredible read. It's intellectually vigorous. It's academically vigorous. You will learn a great deal from it in so many different areas particularly the hypnotism side I was really intrigued with. I was very much intrigued with the possession. And Terry goes into great detail about dissociative personality syndrome. He cites many cases of this as well. So it's a profoundly important book, and one that I think is an essential reading for anybody who's interested in this phenomenon. Right, okay, I'm aware we're coming towards the end now of our over 2 hours again. Terry, I know it's always quite difficult with you because so many people want to contact you, but are there any ways that people can contact you, or anything else, via the website or whatever?
The stream of cases that I have coming through is just about manageable. And this is why I asked you to take down the reference to my website, because I don't want to attract any more inquiries. But this reinforces the need for an institution to deal with this. I'm just one person, and I've been training people to help me because of the workflow. But it's a difficult thing to train people to do for some of the reasons I've explained. It's dangerous work. People ask to be trained for their own reasons, not necessarily for a spiritual vocation themselves. If they want to find another avenue of making money, but exploiting the sick is not the way to go. So what I'm looking for, the only thing I'm looking for now, really, is an institution that is willing to conduct serious clinical trials. What I'm looking for is a clinic or a psychiatric hospital that's willing to test the hypothesis, does this method work? And that involves not being on the ward at all. It's done remotely. Patient, ward members, hospital administration, they don't even need to know about it because it's all done surreptitiously, beyond conscious awareness, by using telepathy. All these mechanisms that are beyond mechanistic science. And what I've suggested to those people who do work in hospitals, it's very easy to set up a spirit release group for your local hospital. You can do it from your front room. You don't have to be on site. You just ask the medium and the spirit guide to access the hospital. Are there any earthbound spirits around? Going back to answering your earlier question, you locate the earthbound spirits, and very often you'll find spirits that have people who've died in their hospital bed. They can be quite amusing. I said to through a medium, I said, "Are there any earthbound spirits?" And she said, "Yes, I see a man there. He's quite old." So I said, approach him and ask him what he's doing. And she's obviously manifested herself, spiritually speaking, to this, and he's seen her. And this is by location. You can project yourself and be seen by another person. And he said, "Who are you?" And she said, "What's your name?" He said, "What's got to do with you?" I said, "An ordinary person being approached by a stranger. I'm here to help." So I said, ask him these questions. "What are you doing here?" He said, "Well, I'm not very well, am I? I've got a dodgy ticker." So I said, "Well, why are you walking about through the medium? Why are you walking about?" He said, I want to go home. I'm going home." So I said, "Have they fixed you up then?" And he said, "I'm not really sure." This is the first thing in answer to your question about earthbound spirits. Those that have died and don't realise they're dead are very, very confused because they can approach someone and speak to them, and the ordinary person can't see or hear them because they're spirit. But a medium presenting herself as spirit can enter into dialogue. So I said to him, "Where are you going?" "I'm going home." "Oh, they fixed you up then, have they?" He said, "Well, I'm not really sure about that." I said to the medium, "Come on, let's get back to your bed." "All right then." So he's walked back to his bed. And I knew what he was going to find. I said, what do you see? He saw his body laying in the bed. He said, there's two of me, aren't there? I said, yep. He said, and then it twigged. He said, oh, I'm a goner, aren't I? I said, yeah. Do you want us to help you now? Total confusion. So he invited someone to come from the light that he knew, a loved one, family member, to escort him off. Now, that service should be provided in every hospital by somebody. Hospital authorities don't even need to know about it. You can do it from your front room. We did it from a healing center, from a health clinic in the West Country, for a hospital down in somewhere else.
I think death doulas are becoming more of a regular feature now with end of life care. Like we have birth doulas. My friend Tree Carr works as a death doula now. I think she's been a guest on your show already.
What's a death doula?
So it's someone who just helps someone come to terms with dying, stays by their bedside, talks to them, counsels them through the kind of last stages, and often, more importantly, helps their relatives to come to terms with it. And so it's very similar to a birth doula, someone who's there to help them with the kind of emotional trauma of giving birth. A death doula is there for the end of life care to treat death as this, like you say, a sort of transitioning onto the next stage, to not make it so terrifying.
But most of the earthbounds we come across are either the result of sudden death, murder, catastrophe, or they have unfinished business, or they didn't believe in an afterlife, and so they don't know where to go. They don't see the light when it's presented to them. And there are practitioners who specialise in dealing with earthbound spirits, because it takes compassion and so on to get them to the light.
Well, I think what would be useful there, wouldn't be, if the two, because it seems that, they're both the death doulas at one side of the divide, and then there are the guys, that the other side of the divide, maybe working together in some way, because obviously this is something that is probably needed. It's, after birth, it's probably the most traumatic and strangest thing any of us are going to go through in our lives and in our deaths. Right, I'm aware I'm about to run out of time now. So, Terry, thank you so much for, as Sarah said, that just flashed by. It was just fascinating and interesting and intriguing. Brings up as many questions as it does answers, but we're not looking necessarily for answers in these. We're looking for just discussion and ideas and everything else. So Terry, thank you very much for that. Right, everybody, just to let you know that coming towards the end, with next week's show is going to be a very interesting one indeed. It's a gentleman called Bill Merthyr, or Will Merthyr is now known, who had the most extraordinary near-death experience in the sea off Dawlish in 1999. He's been on, I've interviewed him 2 or 3 times, and he's a friend of mine. His experience is unbelievable. Not only this, but his experience and the way he was saved in the end ended up on, there used to be a TV programme on British television called, I think it was Emergency 999 with Michael Burke. He actually featured on this programme from how they saved him. But you will get the background story to what happened to him in the sea. And believe me, it is extraordinary. And then the following week, we've got a guy joining us called Dave Green. And Dave Green and I have been working on an experiment to do with lucid dreaming, as to whether people can pick up information about somebody in a lucid dreaming state, then draw a picture and bring it back to this reality and to check. And believe me, something kicked off today that was the most extraordinary experience I think I've ever had. You are not going to believe this. This will blow your mind, but you're going to have to wait for 2 weeks for it. But believe me, we have proof. Okay, thanks everybody, and thanks for listening in. And as always, thanks very much for my guest, Terry Palmer, who was wonderful. Get hold of his book. It is terrific. And as always, Sarah, thank you so much for spending your time down there. I noticed you all wrapped up in your blanket and everything else. It's fairly cool these days, but it's wonderful. So thanks, everybody. And thanks again. And we'll see you again next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Terry.
Bye. Bye, Terry.